Walter, we were talking yesterday about my favorite allegories, and of course, Sir Knight of the Splendid Way is my all-time favorite allegory, written by Kuehl in 1896. I'll probably read that book for the rest of my life. But there's another series. It's a trilogy called Tales of the Kingdom series. It's Tales of the Kingdom, Tales of the Resistance, and Tales of the Restoration. But in that allegory, it was originally written for children. But I have found that most adults love it just as much as children. In fact, I have read it to children over 100 times.
I know my wife loves that. She just loves it.
Oh, there's something about these stories. They're kind of, I don't know, I almost want to say they're anointed stories. But it's a story about, here's a picture of my favorite one, Tales of the Resistance. It's a picture of this enchanted city. You go back in this enchanted city where everything is dark. There's no such thing as a king and death to pretenders. People work during the night and sleep during the day, and it's forbidden to see the light. And in this enchanted city, where nothing seems to be real, people's eyes are not open to the truth. For example, in this story, there's Thespia. Her mother is a believer, and she knows that there's a king in a real kingdom, and she says the sunset's beautiful. But her daughter protests, and she says, "Mother, seeing is believing, and believing is seeing." And so Thespia does not have a heart or eyes to see the truth. And it's interesting because I was reading in the book of Luke just yesterday. In the very last chapter of the book of Luke, there are these two disciples of Jesus. Jesus has just died, and he has been now dead for 3 days, and he has risen, and they go to the grave, and they can't find his body. And there are two disciples, and they're on the road to a place called Emmaus, and as they're walking, this stranger walks up to them and asks them, what they're talking about, and they look at him kind of like, "You don't know what's been going on here in Jerusalem?
Right.
Are you a stranger?" And he says, "Well, what things?" And they says, "Well, Jesus, the prophet of God has come, and they killed him, and we thought he was going to be the real Messiah, and obviously he wasn't." And then he starts talking to them about all of the scriptures that pertain to himself, the Christ. And their hearts were burning within them. And it says, but they did not know that it was him because their eyes had not been opened. And I find that as a parallel to what this book is about, this allegory of Tales of the Resistance, going back into the enchanted city, because there the people's eyes also have not been opened. What I love about the last chapter in Luke, however, is that after Jesus breaks bread with them and they hear his words and the thankfulness that he has, and probably saw the scars on his hands, they understood who it was, and at that moment the scripture says that he vanished from their sight, and they couldn't wait to go and tell people. Well, in this particular story of Tales of the Resistance, Thespia's mother is dying. On her deathbed, she tells her the story that there is a real king and a real kingdom, and the sunset is beautiful. It's one of my favorite parts, and as I begin this story, I'd like to just kind of dedicate this story to a new friend of mine. I met this friend on an airplane on my way to Montana, and as I tell the story, I would like her to sense this kingdom of which this mother is speaking about. And so this is how it starts. She says to her daughter, she says, "There is a real king and a real kingdom, and the sunset is beautiful." But Thespia protests, as I said before. She says, "Mother, seeing is believing, and believing is seeing. If there was a king, then why does he allow us to live in all this hardship and misery? Why has he not rescued us and redeemed us?" Her mother begged her daughter to believe, but she would not because she could not, because for her seeing was believing. It was then, after her mother died, that the enchanter came to take her away. You see, when children were deformed or orphaned, the enchanter with his men, with their cudgels, would come and they would take the children away and they would place them underground. They were called boiler brats and sewer rats. Children rarely lived past 14 years of age. And often the children would be severely beaten if they didn't do their job right by putting the hot coals in the furnaces to keep the man-made power going, and one child would usually die. But this night would be different. When they came to take Thespia from her home after her mother died, they would usually take a hot poker and they would sear the child's forehead so that they would always know that they belonged to the enchanter. But this night was different because one look at Thespia's long, luxuriant golden hair Just the twist of her wrist and the wink of her eye could capture the heart of anyone. And the enchanter looked at her and said, "This child's mine. Take her to the palace." You see, the beautiful children of the enchanted city were allowed to be a part of the palace of players. They honed out their art of acting, and once a month, the common people that would come to the great theater, they would come with their runny sores and their lack of hope and their haggard clothes. But they would forget their sorrows for a season, because on this one night, the players would come forth and they would act out these marvelous plays. But this night would be different, because the enchanter, realizing there was no more threat of rebellion, allowed one of the plays to come out of the archives that had been there for over 100 years.
The Return of the King.
It was called The Return of the King. And this night, Thespia would act for her very first time. She would walk out on stage and take her bow, and the people would chant, "Thespia, Thespia, we love Thespia." When she took her bow, she noticed, though, something very, very unusual. There was a man standing in the back of the auditorium, standing what appeared to be in his own light. And just at that moment, all of the lights went dim and everything was dark. And the people moaned and shouted, the children, they said. You see, when there were power outages, that meant that children underground, the boiler brats and sewer rats, that meant that someone wasn't doing their job, and one of the children would be severely beaten tonight and one would die. But not tonight, because the man began to walk down the aisle in his own light. And when he walked to the edge of the orchestra pit, he vaulted up on stage, and Thespia took out her hand and helped him up forward. And when she touched him, a complete warmth radiated through her entire body. She had never felt anything so gentle and so warm in all her life. The man turned from Thespia and looked at the orchestra, the musicians, and he said, "Music, up-tempo." They began to play in such a way that the music was infectious. They didn't even know why they were following the man's commands. It was as if he was the conductor himself. Just then, the man looked at the people, and he opened his arms and said, "Have you ever heard of a kingdom where the king lived in it and loved his people?" "No," said the people. "Have you ever heard of a kingdom where everything's right?" "No," said the people. They've never heard words like these before. Thespia walked up to the man in defiance and said, "Sir, how do we find this kingdom of which you speak?" He looked at Thespia and said, "Thespia, the real kingdom is wherever I walk and anyone who walks with me." She never heard words like these before. She didn't know what to say. But the man turned from Thespia, looked at the orchestra, and once again put his hand down and said, "Music, played a stage whisper." And they obeyed his voice. The music again was just beautifully played, and the people were listening to every word of the man. Just then the man looked at the people and said, "In the kingdom of light, the day shines bright." "Ah," sighed the people. "Day, light? They worked during the night, they slept during the day. It was forbidden to see the light." Just then Thespia walked up to the man once again and said, "Sir, how do we know what you're saying is true?" The man looked at Thespia, not into her eyes, but into her heart, and said, "Thespia, I've come to seek and to save those who are lost. Follow me," said the man. Tears began to flow, not players' tears, but real tears. He took the back of his hand and wiped away her tears. Again, she had never been touched like that in her entire life. She took the man's hand in hers, and for the first time her eyes were open. And she raised the man's hand high in hers, looking at the crowd as if giving an introduction. She said, "My people, your king. My king, your people." Just then the manmade power turned on and everything was bright, and someone in the wealthy patron boxes shouted out, "There's no such thing as a king! Death to pretenders!" And people started to chant, "Death, death, death," they said. And all of a sudden the glow of the man started to diminish, and he began to button his coat as if he meant to leave. Are you leaving?" she said. "Yes. The moment for believing has now ended." "Follow me," said the man. And the two of them left the theater together, and very few seemed to see them go. And Thespia, she became a player in the back alleys and dead ends of Enchanted City, acting out the king's story in such a way that all who saw her suspected and then hoped that there was a real king and a real kingdom. Like the king, she wore common clothes, And she never gave the luxuries of the palace a backwards glance, because when one has found one's real love, it is easy to leave behind what has only been